As a kid growing up, I didn't like to get in trouble, and I mean, most people don't. There's like very few of us wake up and are like, man, I love to get in trouble. And so as a kid, I would inevitably find myself getting in trouble, and whenever I did get in trouble, I would inevitably say the same two words. You guys can care to guess what that is? Anybody? Uh-oh. No, I would say I'm sorry. This was my Pavlovian response. Like whenever I would get in trouble, those would be the words that would come out of my mouth every single time. And I can reflect back on my childhood of all of the times where I got in trouble and responded with, I'm sorry. I remember one vividly. It was a time when I was ending up my fifth grade year. It was an exciting time because the end of fifth grade meant no more elementary school. And I was at that stage in life, in fifth grade is when you start to get just a little bit more freedom that your parents give you, which is also another way of saying it was a great opportunity for me to get in trouble even worse than I did before. And so I remember the last day of fifth grade, my parents said, you know what, when school's over, it was a half day, feel free to go home. You can invite one of your close friends over and you guys can hang out and have fun and just play together. And I thought this was great. And so I invited one of my friends and we went to my house, and sure enough, we got there and we did all of like the kid things, like all of the like parental approved activities. Like we played some video games, we shot some hoops, and we kind of tried to make food together, which in itself was a disaster. But pretty shortly after we had done all of those parental approved activities, we found ourselves just kind of bored, and we were like, what's next? Like, what do we want to do to fill the rest of this day? And so we found ourselves suddenly, pretty quickly, out in the garage. And the thing is, garages have all sorts of amazing things to play with. And sure enough, my parents' garage, it was the same way. And so my buddy and I, we got out in the garage and we started looking around, like, what are we going to do in the garage? And rather quickly, we really kind of assembled three items. It was a can of hairspray, newspapers, and a blowtorch. And I know you might be thinking, well, that seems like an odd combination of products to go together, and it might be odd unless you're doing skeet shooting with a flamethrower. Then it makes perfect sense. And so we thought, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get all of these newspapers, and we're going to wad up the newspapers into small little balls. And then one of us will yell, pull. And when we yell pull, the other person will lob the newspaper, and it would go flying through the air in the garage. And then what we had to do is we had the blowtorch in one hand, and we would just take the can of hairspray, and we would just hit the blowtorch, turning it into a flamethrower. And if you actually hit the piece of the newspaper and it landed on the ground on fire, you got a point. First to 10 wins. It's a real simple game, people. And so we started, you'd get a couple turns and you'd switch, and we were having a ton of fun. Now, again, we were fifth graders, and so to some extent, we don't realize the ramifications of what we're doing. Apparently, there's a possibility for the flame to get in the can, and with the pressure in the can, causing the thing to explode. I mean, that's what people tell me. I don't really know if that happens, but my parents made that clear later when we got found out. Also didn't realize at the time that all of the points, the balls of fire on the ground, because of a breeze in the garage, had kind of worked their way under my dad's classic car, just sitting there underneath the gas tank, a perfectly safe place for things to be burning. And so as this game's going on, we're enjoying it. We're not mindful of everything else that's happening. And fortunately for adult me, unfortunate for kid me, my dad came home unannounced about 2 hours early from work. And I'll never forget when he walked into the garage. I mean, it was mid-game. Mid-game, he came in, he immediately sees what's going on, and he's filled with, we'll just call it righteous anger. He's I don't even remember what he said, but I remember before he had walked in, I had yelled, pull. So my dad walks in, tension arises, he's yelling, I'm like, and at the same time, I see him and I'm like, I'm sorry. I got the point. My dad quickly sent my buddy home, and I made it out of the garage alive. I don't really know how. And I remember that night we sat down, and my dad asked me, he said, "Son, why are you sorry?" And I remember saying, like, "Dad, I'm sorry. Like, I'm sorry you're mad. I'm sorry I got caught. I'm sorry I'm in trouble. Like, I'm just sorry. Like, that's what I'm supposed to say, right? Like, sorry." And then he said these words, and I'll never forget them because they've stuck with me my whole life. He said, "Son, I don't want you to just say sorry. I want you to understand why you're sorry." And I remember thinking, like, why does it matter? Like, why that shouldn't matter at all? And really, I wrestled with that, like, my life, like, my whole life. Like, why do I need to understand why I'm sorry? And then I had kids. You know, and there's something about kids, like, when you have kids, in that moment, you suddenly, replay your childhood, and you realize your parents were actually brilliant. Like, right? Like, when you have kids, you're like, oh my gosh, that makes total sense now, because I understand it with my kids. Like, I don't want them just to say sorry. I want them to understand what they're actually sorry about. Just to say sorry is nothing but an external action. But to understand why you're sorry tells us something about what's happening on the inside. And the truth is, in our society today, there is often a disconnect. I've seen it in my own life. There's a disconnect between what's happening on the outside and what we're experiencing on the inside. And maybe another way to say it is this: there's a disconnect between our actions and our hearts. And we see it everywhere. We see it in our own lives, that these two things don't always align. And that's problematic. And it's something that we need to discuss. This morning, we are continuing in our series, Best Sermon Ever. And we're calling it that because it's a look at the Sermon on the Mount, which was the longest continuous teaching of Jesus found in the Bible. And we really do believe that it is the best sermon ever. It is the best message that has ever been taught. And we're not talking about it because of the length of the message. We're talking about it because of the content. Because we really believe that in it are foundational principles for living. And whether you're not a Christian or if you are a Christ follower like me, we believe that if you apply these principles to your life, you will experience a better and more full life. And so over the course of 6 weeks, we're just kind of taking chunks of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 to Matthew 7, and unpacking it. And this morning, we're going to be looking at a portion of that sermon that I've just called Upping the Ante. And because it's something we kind of get, this kind of one-upsmanship thing. And it seems like, as we read some of these passages, that that's what Jesus is doing. Matter of fact, just so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from, let's just dive into the first one in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. And if you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount or have heard it, these passages will be pretty familiar to you. Jesus says in verse 21, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.'" So this first part here, "you have heard." When Jesus says this, what he's referring to is the Old Testament law. It was the guiding ethic in the lives of the people of Israel. It's what they centered their lives on. And what the people of Israel believed is that if they could adhere to the law, not just individually, but collectively, as a community, if they could adhere and uphold the law, then what they believed was that God would fulfill his promise, who would send the Messiah, who would free them from their oppression and restore them back to their rightful place. And so all of their lives is about adhering to the law. And so when Jesus begins talking to the crowd in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, this is what he's referencing to. The law says that you shouldn't murder anyone. And if you do murder someone, you will be subject to judgment. Whatever the law defines as that punishment, that's what you will subject yourself to. But then Jesus says in verse 22, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with their brother or sister will be subject to judgment." So Jesus says, look, this is what the law says. This is what you guys have used as kind of your guiding, again, directive in your life. But Jesus says, what I'm telling you is that if you're angry with a brother or sister, And this is not just like momentary anger. This is sort of the lingering anger that leads to violence. And he's not talking about your biological brothers and sisters. Jesus is like, look, if you're angry with someone in your community in such a way that you want to be moved to violence, you will be subject to the same judgment. So again, it seems like, well, the law says this, but Jesus is seemingly upping the ante. And I have to imagine for the crowd that's gathered there, like they're excited, they're anticipating everything that Jesus might say, and they hear this and they have to be thinking like, is he for real? Like, is this really what he expects? Like, it's hard enough for us to actually follow the law the way it is, and now he's telling us that if we have this kind of anger towards people in our community, then we're going to be subject to the same judgment. Like, Jesus must have lost his mind. But the thing is, like, what I love about Jesus is if it's not clear what he says, he like doubles down. He makes it abundantly clear, and that's what he does. He continues in verse 27. He says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Same format, same structure here. You have heard it said. The law says you're not allowed to commit adultery. But then Jesus says in verse 28, but I tell you, that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, this is a long gazing, this pursuit of a person mentally. If you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. And again, the crowd has to be hearing this thinking, Jesus, how do you expect me to do this? Like, we're struggling enough just to follow the law as it is. And so it would have made sense for them, and as it is for us, that Jesus is seemingly changing the law. He's upping the ante on adherence. He's expecting more out of this group of people than anyone else has expected at any point in history. And it would seem like that unless we understand where Jesus is coming from. And he makes that clear in the verses that precede this, in verses 17 and 18. Jesus says, look, I'm going to tell you what I'm actually all about. I'm going to tell you why I'm teaching you these things before he begins to teach it. And this is what we read here in verse 17. He says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus says, look, I'm not here to do away with the law. I'm not here to get rid of it. I'm not here to rewrite it. It's not just that I'm not here to abolish the law. He says, look, or the prophets. And the prophets were the leaders in the people of Israel. They're the ones who became the spokesperson or the spokespeople for God. And what Jesus is saying is, look, all of the foundations of your faith, I affirm. Like, I'm not trying to ditch them, but I am trying to fulfill them. And there's a big distinction here. And we have to talk about it. Because a lot of us, when we hear that Jesus is here to fulfill the law, sometimes we can think, well, what that means is that Jesus is actually here to keep the law. And there's a distinction, there's a difference between fulfilling the law and keeping the law. One of the things that we know is that to fulfill the law, that when a person tries to fulfill the law, it means that they're trying to satisfy everything the law intended to accomplish. And the law, what God makes clear is the law is to point people towards their need for God, their need for Jesus. But to keep the law means literally just to do what it says. So I want to make that point again because it's important for us to understand the difference. To fulfill the law is to satisfy everything that the law sets to accomplish. But to keep the law simply means to do what it says. And the people of Israel had kind of centered their lives around this idea of keeping the law. For them, it had become so much about external actions. They cared that they looked the part from the outside, regardless of what was happening on the inside. As long as they looked like a good Jewish person looked, That's all that mattered, regardless of their inward condition. And this sort of behavior was so prevalent in Jewish circles that it literally impacted pretty much everyone in the culture of that time. All they focused on was, how do we look like good Jewish people on the outside, regardless of what's happening on the inside? And matter of fact, one of the most scathing critiques that Jesus gives anywhere in the New Testament is towards a group of religious leaders, a group of Pharisees, who are far more concerned with what they look like on the outside than who they are on the inside. See, Jesus acknowledges the disconnect. He sees the gap between people who they present themselves to be and who they actually are. So Jesus addresses this in Matthew 23, beginning in verse 27. Jesus says, "Woe to you! Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." This phrase here, "woe to you," it's not something that we commonly use in our culture today. Like when you're upset with someone, you don't walk up to them and go, "Woe to you." I mean, you should try it one time. When we read this word, "woe to you," it's not that Jesus is just expressing dissatisfaction with this group of people. That literally it's eating at him the very core. Like, there's not a great English word to describe it, but it's a groaning from the deepest parts of his inside, that there is a condemnation to what Jesus is saying. And the reason why he's so just like torn up about this is because if there was any group of people who should understand how important it is for the internal and the external to be linked together, it should be this group of people. It should be the religious leaders. It should be the Pharisees, but they seem to have missed it all. And so Jesus is saying, look, it eats at me. It eats at me that you live like this, and it makes you hypocrites. And then Jesus begins to paint this vivid picture. He talks about whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are just full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. And then what Jesus does is he moves from this abstract image to the personal. And this is what he says beginning in verse 28. He says that in the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Wow. Jesus holds nothing back. To this group of religious leaders, to this group of Pharisees who know better, they are nothing more than wicked, hypocritical people. See, the Pharisees, they understood what it was supposed to look like on the outside. They walked the walk, they talked the talk. The issue for the Pharisees was not what they were producing on the outside, but it's what they lacked on the inside. And it was true of them, but it was also true of the people of Israel. They had lost sight of this. Their relationship became a religion. For the Pharisees, for the people of Israel, their relationship became a religion. What was intended to be this beautiful connection between God and his people had unraveled into nothing more but heartless practice. So as Jesus is gathering with this group of people, what he's teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount, he's making it very clear that what he's building is different. That his way of approaching God is different, and the expectations are different than the people in the past. It's different than the way it's been modeled for them. So Jesus says, look, you have been told, you have heard that you shouldn't commit murder, but I tell you, if you're angry with someone, you've already done it. You shouldn't commit murder. That's an outward action, but where does anger begin? Inside. See, Jesus' focus is what's happening on the inside, what's happening in our hearts. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. The people think, well, it's about the action. It's about committing the act of adultery. But Jesus says, look, you actually sin in your heart. What matters the most is what happens on the inside. And here's one of the things that Jesus realizes. If he can get these people to understand that what he cares about is their hearts, he knows that their actions will be the natural byproduct. Unfortunately, many Christians in the world today, if we're being honest, including us, have gotten this backwards. We really feel, like many of these Pharisees, that it's all about looking the part. It's all about acting the way that we're supposed to act. But what we need to understand is that what God cares about is our heart, not your behaviors. God cares more, infinitely more, about your heart than what you look like on the outside. And so many Christ followers become so concerned about what we look like on the outside. We become so concerned with looking like a good Christian should look, really not even having any idea what that's supposed to look like, and not understanding how much that changes regarding the cultural context that we live in. But we focus our whole lives on performing on the outside, making it about behavior, instead of purifying our lives on the inside, which makes it about the heart. We have made our faith nothing more than a religion. We've hijacked our relationship with God to make it about our performance from him, for him. And this is what it looks like. We tell ourselves, look, God will be appeased. God will be happy if we simply do what he says. And so we love our neighbors. We look out for orphans. We care for widows. We speak out against issues of injustice and oppression and hatred. And we speak out in love and truth and grace. And what we tell ourselves is when we do these things, when we do all of it, then God will be satisfied. He'll be happy with us. But he won't. He won't. If, and don't miss this if your heart isn't motivating you to those actions, if you're just speaking grace, truth, and love, if you're speaking out against injustice and hatred, if you're doing it just because you feel like you should, then you've missed the point. Doing these things means nothing if our hearts aren't what is motivating it. Because God cares more about our hearts than our behaviors. And if we're going to continue to live our lives focused on what we look like on the outside, if we're going to live lives that are about performing, about being about the things or doing the things that Christians, good Christians, should do, then what Jesus says is that we are nothing more than a Pharisee, that we're whitewashed tombs. And what Jesus says to people like that, like us, is that we're nothing but hypocrites. Now the thing is, we're not really big fans of that word hypocrite. It has taken on a lot of meaning in our society today, but the word in itself is a Greek word. It is a Greek word that is commonly applied to a stage actor. A hypocrite was someone who would wear a mask to play a part. And all throughout the Gospels, when Jesus talks about hypocrites, he's applying to the same context. It's a group of people who put on this false face, who pretend to be something that they are not. That there's an inconsistency between their outward actions and inward motivation. And Jesus' point is that if we're going to be so concerned about what we look like on the outside, and we ignore what's happening on the inside, then we are nothing more than hypocrites. And none of us like this word. None of us want that word applied to us, to apply to our lives, applied to our own faith journey, which is why it's important for all of us to be willing to wrestle and to answer this question: what motivates your actions? What propels you to do the things you do? When it comes to your job, what motivates your action? When it comes to your relationships, what motivates your actions? When it comes to your faith, how do you answer that? I want you to wrestle with this question. And for some of you, that might mean you need to write it down in your notes, that you need to go home, that you need to ponder this. I promise you, until you can answer this question, you cannot fully understand the life that Jesus is calling his followers to live. Now, if you're here this morning and you don't consider yourself a Christ follower, then to be perfectly honest, it doesn't matter what motivates your actions. Like, you can choose whatever motivation that you want. Now, I'm not going to say that that motivation is going to be beneficial for you. I'm not going to say that motivation is going to lead to the kind of life that you want to live. I'm just saying if you're not a Christ follower, like you play by a different set of rules. You can decide what it is that motivates you. But for those of us who consider ourselves Christians, the answer to this has to be different. Because Jesus makes it pretty clear that our actions should be an overflow of a heart that is in pursuit of God. And some of you who are here today, I mean, you've experienced this in your life. You know, because you've spent your life in pursuit of God, and as you pursue him, you get filled more with him, and your heart becomes more aligned with God's heart. And so maybe you're sitting here thinking, what motivates my actions? Love. Jesus. He's what motivates my actions. But I also know that there's others of us who are in this room who our walk with God is really a checklist. It's about coming to church on Sunday. It's about doing the things, again, performing on the outside, the things we believe good Christian people should do. But your heart, the inside, is not being motivated by a loving relationship with Jesus. So I want to encourage you to pursue that. To stop pretending, stop performing, and to start pursuing. It doesn't have to be difficult. I mean, when you think about your other relationships, when you think about your spouse and there's a disconnect with your spouse, what do? You pursue your spouse. When there's a disconnect with your kids, what do? You pursue your kids. We want to bring harmony in relationships. We know it comes from our pursuit, but for some reason, when it comes to our relationship with God, when we feel a disconnect with God, we do the opposite. We say it's about performing. It's about checking the list. It's about doing the things, again, good Christians should do. But I would tell you that you will get far further, faster. You'll be fuller if you stop performing and start pursuing. So really simple. If you can't answer that God is the motivator of your actions, this is what I'm going to encourage you to do. Every day, open up your Bible and spend time with him. Every day, pray. These simple actions will bring about profound change. And you will see as you commit to pursue God, you will see that your heart begins to align with God's heart. And when your heart is aligning with God's heart, then you'll begin to see that your actions are no longer motivated by people's perceptions or what you want people to believe about you. They're motivated by a heart that's in love with Jesus. If you commit to this, I promise you that you will see your religion find its way back into a relationship. And that's Jesus' point. When it comes to following him, when it comes to this new thing he's building, it's not like the past. It's not about performing. It's not about doing what you think you're supposed to do on the outside. It's about God allowing him to purify our lives from the inside. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much. I thank you for Jesus' words and the encouragement to do this differently. And God, there's something in all of us that leans towards this tendency to perform, to walk the walk, to talk the talk. But what your son makes it clear is that's insignificant if our hearts aren't in the right place. And so, God, I just pray for the encouragement and the strength to begin to align our lives with you. Pray that you would give us the knowledge to know that when we step out and we stop performing, that we're actually doing what is best. God, that we would start pursuing. And humbly as we do this, God, I ask that your Spirit would work in us and that our lives would be transformed from the inside out. We're grateful for all that Jesus does. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. I want to just take a second as we wrap up here just to say thank you so much for coming. Thanks for being with us. If you're newer here at Lake Sawyer, maybe this is your first time, I want to invite you over here to the Connection Zone. We have a team of people there who would love to meet with you. Like Jennifer mentioned, we have a gift just to say thank you for hanging out with us. And so if you have any questions or kind of would like some direction on where to get plugged in here at Lake Sawyer, please head over there right when the service is over. I also want to let you know that next week we're going to be continuing in our series, Best Sermon Ever, and we're going to be looking at Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. And there couldn't be a more timely topic in our world today. And so I'm really excited to unpack that from Jesus' perspective. I'm telling you that because I think it's a great opportunity for you to invite friends, invite the people that you know, people who even think differently than you do, because we really believe that God is going to teach us something about how all of us can live together to something greater. And so look forward to seeing you back next week, and have a great week and enjoy the beautiful sunshine.